What actually happened in a medieval battle? You might think of a medieval battle as a whirlwind of gleaming swords, armored knights, and heroic cries echoing across fields of glory. But that picture is mostly a product of paintings and popular myth. Before anyone drew a blade or galloped into the fray, a medieval battle was a waiting game. A slow buildup of logistics, poorly dug latrines, damp tents, grumbling men, and a lot of nervous anticipation. Let's walk through one of these quiet preludes to carnage, in a place and time most have forgotten, the Battle of Shrewsbury, July 1403. It had rained the night before, softening the ground under the boots of several thousand men. The soil outside, the town of Shrewsbury, had become sponge-like, and men cursed as their shoes came up sticky and heavy with each step. They were not all knights or warriors. Many were local peasants pressed into service, holding spears and poles. Others were archers, professionals some, but many not. The English crown, under King Henry IV, had called up levies to meet the rebellion of Henry Hotspur Percy, a former ally turned rival. Percy had marched south quickly, perhaps too quickly, hoping to catch the king off guard. Before the battle, both armies spent days on the move. The king's forces had come from the south and east, relying on pack animals and ox-drawn carts to haul their supplies. These wagons creaked with barrels of salted beef, wheels of hard cheese, sacks of dried peas, arrows, iron tools, canvas, and the wooden beams for tents and shelters. A makeshift camp took hours to erect. First came the command tents, larger, with canvas sides and ropes that needed staking down. Then came rows of soldier tents, more like thick canvas blankets stretched over sticks. Sleeping arrangements were tight. A man might sleep next to someone he barely knew, on a straw-stuffed sack crawling with fleas. During these hours, small details mattered. Who got fed first? How was water gathered? Streams nearby were muddy and questionable, so water was often boiled, or more often not. Dysentery spread fast. A soldier's diet the night before battle might be a hard biscuit soaked in beer or gruel made of oats. Fresh meat was rare. Horses were not to be eaten unless truly desperate. Officers, of course, had better food, better bedding, and sometimes even musicians. As for armor, only a few could afford a full suit of plate. Most had chainmail or partial coverage. Padded gambesons, thick quilted coats, were common. They smelled of sweat and mildew, and weighed heavily when wet. Helmets varied. Some men had kettle hats, others bassinets, and many simply tied cloth around their heads. The image of a field full of knights in shining armor was far from true. Many looked more like a tired militia than a polished army. The night before the battle, messengers moved between tents. Orders were written, read aloud, and changed. Some soldiers were awake into the night, sharpening arrowheads or knives. Others sat by fires, playing dice or muttering prayers. The fear was quiet but present. Many had never fought before. The veterans among them were often the least talkative. They had seen what it meant: splintered bones, the stink of blood, and the noise that filled the ears long after the clash. In Nar, the pre-dawn hours, animals stirred. Horses snorted and shifted tied to posts. Birds called from trees nearby, unaware of the coming violence. The first sounds of armor being strapped on filled the air. Archers rubbed resin on their bowstrings. The sun would rise soon, casting a light mist across the low hills. Scouts returned with reports. The Percys were arrayed across the field, taking a strong defensive position. They had archers, many of them Welsh, skilled and bitter. King Henry's commanders argued over tactics. Attack quickly, try to flank, wait for reinforcements. There were no radios, no maps with little icons. Decisions were made based on rough sketches drawn in the dirt or reports shouted across horse lines. Communication was difficult, especially once battle began. Horns and flag signals helped, but chaos always broke in. As morning grew, so did the tension. Men stood silently in ranks, holding spears or bows, sweating despite the morning chill. The king's banner, a golden lion, was hoisted high. Hotspur's banner, depicting a silver crescent, faced them across the meadow. Two armies, both English, prepared to fight. Most of these men were not ideologues. They had no clear sense of what their side stood for beyond loyalty, pay, and the hope of surviving long enough to return home. One must understand the terrain to appreciate what came next. The field was uneven, interrupted by clumps of brush and slight rises that could break a line. A small ridge gave Percy's forces a slight advantage, allowing their archers to shoot downhill. King Henry's men, forming up at a disadvantage, muttered curses and tightened their grips. A few final speeches were made. The king reportedly addressed his men briefly, urging loyalty and courage. Hotspur, on the other side, was more passionate. This was his rebellion, and he had promised justice. Some of his followers believed they were fighting for a better England. Others followed simply because they owed allegiance to the Percy name. Still, despite all the shouting, sharpening, and marching, the day's most common sound was silence. Thousands stood in still ranks listening. A bird's wings, a breeze in the grass, the creak of a leather strap. There was no grand moment where two lines instantly clashed. Battles were often preceded by waiting. Nervous, terrible waiting. And what of the non-combatants? Behind the lines, washerwomen, cooks, and surgeons prepared their tools. A medieval surgeon's kit was crude: knives, clamps, saws, linen bandages, and ointments of vinegar or herbs. They expected wounds, and they knew how many died not on the field but afterward from infection. Nearby, camp followers, wives, children, merchants huddled trying to stay out of view. War, after all, was never just about warriors. And as the two armies finally faced each other in full, with banners flapping and nerves stretched thin, you might ask, what was it that brought so many men here, to a muddy field in Shropshire, ready to kill others they had never met? The first sounds of battle weren't steel on steel or the thunder of hooves, but the snap and hiss of bowstrings. At Shrewsbury, July 1403, the fighting began not with a charge, but with a rain of arrows launched by hundreds of English longbowmen. On both sides, the air filled with the unmistakable groan of wooden yew bending under tension, followed by the sharp twang of release. It was fast, rhythmic, and terribly effective. The English longbow, nearly 6 feet in length, was more than a weapon. It was a tool of social conditioning. Archery practice had been required by law for generations, ensuring a large pool of skilled bowmen. By the time of Shrewsbury, these archers could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute, turning a quiet field into a deadly forest of falling shafts within seconds. The first volleys targeted not the elite knights, but the tightly packed formations of foot soldiers, men with little armor and nowhere to run. Arrows struck with a sickening sound like hammer blows into meat. Some pierced mail and padding, others embedded in thighs, shoulders, or the unguarded neck. Soldiers dropped to their knees, screaming or silent, blood pooling around them in dark patches. Those who could still stand raised shields, crouched low, or scrambled for cover behind corpses or bits of broken cart. Horses, too, became casualties, rearing and flailing as they were hit. A panicked horse could disrupt an entire line, and often did. The king's forces, under the leadership of Henry IV himself, pressed forward despite the arrow storm. The ground was uneven and softened by previous rains, and many men stumbled under the weight of their armor and gear. Still, the movement continued. Trumpets called out orders, and formations realigned. By now, the clamor was rising, shouted commands, the groans of the wounded and the steady drumbeat of marching boots. Close combat began not with a romantic charge, but with the slow, grinding push of one line into another. The term melee fails to capture how physically exhausting and chaotic it was. Soldiers pushed with shoulders and shields, hacked with short swords or polearms, and used daggers to stab into the gaps of armor. There was little elegance. Killing a man often required striking repeatedly, through padding, through chain, through bone. The air became thick with sweat, blood, and dust. Many men collapsed from exhaustion before they were wounded. Those who fell were often trampled. Helmets muffled sound, and visibility was limited. A fighter might only see the man directly in front of him and have no idea whether his side was winning or losing. Panic spread easily. A single rumor, "The king is dead," could send dozens fleeing, which then cascaded into rout. But King Henry was not dead. In fact, he was fighting on foot, surrounded by his bodyguard. This decision was likely both symbolic and tactical. By dismounting, he showed he was not hiding behind a mounted elite. His enemies, Percy's rebels, might claim righteousness, but the king would share the danger of battle. Hotspur, meanwhile, was also in the thick of it. Reports suggest he sought out the royal standard, perhaps hoping to kill the king himself or strike a blow that would demoralize Henry's men. What followed was a brutal encounter at the heart of the field. Hotspur's men managed to break through the royal line at one point, killing the royal standard-bearer and nearly reaching Henry. The chaos this caused was immense. A handful of Henry's guards were slain, and the king himself may have received wounds. Yet it was the rebels who suffered worse. The rebel archers, positioned on a slight rise, had initially held the advantage. But once melee fighting began, their elevated position made them targets. The king's archers, protected by infantry, maneuvered to return fire effectively. Slowly, painfully, the rebel line began to falter. Throughout the afternoon, the battle shifted in surges. A charge on the left flank might push forward, only to retreat minutes later. A small unit of pikemen could hold off a larger force if positioned. Well, there was no master strategy unfolding. Commanders issued orders, but once the lines met, the fight became local, almost personal. Clusters of men fought for their lives in patches of ground no larger than a barnyard. Away from the front, the support staff scrambled. Surgeons worked with grim efficiency, cutting away armor and cleaning wounds with vinegar or boiling water. Amputations were not uncommon. Arrows lodged in limbs were often left in place until a safer moment could be found, if one ever came. Clerics moved among the wounded, offering last rites. A priest with a blood-stained robe might bless 20 men in an hour, whispering the same words over and over. Camp followers looted where they could. When a man fell, others sometimes swarmed to strip his gear: helmets, belts, purses, boots. Some did it for survival, others for greed. A good sword could fetch enough coin to feed a family for a season. This scavenging was both tolerated and condemned. Commanders needed discipline, but they also knew that war was as much about plunder as politics. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting golden light across a field now churned to mud and gore. The smell of death had begun to rise. Flies clustered around open wounds. Horses lay twitching in pools of blood. Some areas of the battlefield were quiet, filled only with groans. Others still echoed with the clang of weapons. The death of Hotspur came suddenly. Conflicting reports describe it differently. Some say he was struck in the face by an arrow. Others that he was killed in close combat. Whatever the cause, his fall broke the momentum of the rebellion. News of his death spread fast. Though many could not see him fall, the ripple effect was felt. Morale collapsed. Units began to flee. Some dropped weapons. Others ran into the woods and hedgerows, hoping to escape capture. King Henry's forces, battered and weary, held the field. Victory was not triumphant. Thousands lay dead or dying. The wounded cried out for water, for mercy, for their mothers. The king reportedly ordered the dead sorted, friend from foe, though often it was difficult to tell. Armor and clothing gave clues, but in some cases corpses had been stripped. Rebels were buried in mass graves. Loyalists were sometimes given more care, but not always. And what of the survivors? Many bore wounds for life: twisted limbs, broken jaws, blindness. Some would never speak of the battle again. Others would talk of nothing else. The trauma lingered. For the lower ranks, there was no pension, no formal recognition. A man might return to his village scarred and sick, with little more than a piece of iron or an infected toe to show for it. For the kingdom, the battle was both decisive and unsettling. It had quelled a rebellion, yes, but at a cost. The king had nearly died. His claim to the throne, already tenuous, had been defended in blood, but not legitimized in the eyes of all. The realm would continue to simmer with unrest. The Battle of Shrewsbury was not a clean victory. It was a muddy, confusing, miserable slog. And yet, in its details, who slipped in the mud, who held the line, who died shouting their commander's name, it tells us more about medieval warfare than any romanticized tale of chivalry and gallant knights. Still, one question loomed as the smoke cleared and the wounded groaned. What became of those who had survived, who had killed and lived through it? What stories did they carry, and what shadows did they leave behind in the quiet days after battle? The battle was over, but the aftermath had only just begun. In some ways it was worse than the fighting itself. There was no music, no cheer, no neat procession of victorious troops or celebratory parades. Instead, the day after the Battle of Shrewsbury, July 1403, dawned over a field of rotting flesh, broken weapons, and silence broken only by the moans of the dying. Crows circled overhead. Dogs sniffed the edges of the carnage. For many, this part of battle, what came next, was the hardest to survive. King Henry IV's forces had technically won, but few among them felt triumphant. The price of victory was stacked in silent, bloodied rows. Thousands had died, many more were injured. As soon as the battle ended, the logistics of the dead began. There were not enough hands to bury everyone individually, so mass graves were dug. These were long, shallow trenches filled hastily. Some bodies were stripped of valuables before burial. Others were simply tossed in, still in partial armor, faces caked with blood and earth. There was no time for ceremony. Those tasked with cleaning up included camp followers, laborers, and the surviving men-at-arms themselves. The smell of decay set in quickly during the July heat. Lime was spread when it was available, not for sanitation, though it helped, but for the psychological comfort of masking rot. Sometimes a priest would say a few words. More often, there was nothing. Just the scrape of shovels and the dull thud of another body hitting earth. Then came the matter of the wounded. Surgeons moved from body to body, prioritizing based on survival odds. In a tent lined with straw, a man with a severed leg might be seen before someone with a punctured gut. Bloodletting was common, as were cauterizations. An arrowhead lodged in muscle might be dug out with forceps, but few instruments were sterilized. Infection was inevitable. Survival often came down to luck, whether the wound festered or sealed cleanly. Antibiotics, of course, were centuries away. Not all wounds were physical. Some men, even uninjured, wandered the camp wide-eyed, unable to speak. Today, we'd recognize this as psychological trauma, or perhaps post-traumatic stress. In the medieval world, it was unnamed. These men were sometimes called ghost-touched, or simply thought to be shaken by divine judgment. There was no treatment. They might be prayed over or ignored. Some never recovered, living out the rest of their lives, with eyes hollowed by what they'd seen. And what of Hotspur? His death had a strange afterlife. Though a rebel, he was not vilified. Instead, he was eulogized as a brave man, a noble warrior who had chosen the wrong cause. Shakespeare, writing centuries later, would turn Hotspur into a near-heroic figure, speaking in bold tones and dying tragically. But the real Hotspur likely died in mud and confusion, his body stripped and displayed as proof of the crown's survival. King Henry's bodyguards eventually recovered Hotspur's corpse. It was decapitated, and his head was mounted on a spike at York city gates, a warning to others. The rest of his remains were quartered and sent to various cities, as was custom for traitors. This brutal practice was as much psychological warfare as punishment. The display of flesh and bone told rebels what awaited them if they raised arms again. Despite the horror, many men returned to their homes within weeks. Those who could walk or ride limped back to villages and towns across England. Some carried new weapons or trinkets looted from the field. Others had nothing but wounds and a changed face. For those who had fought and lived, rejoining normal life was strange. The rhythm of peasant farming, merchant work, or town governance felt foreign after a day of killing. Some tried to forget. Others spoke of it constantly, recounting which lord charged first, who fell where, which archer dropped 5 men in a single volley. Tales grew with time. By winter, the battle had already started to become legend. Songs were written, though few survive. Chroniclers recorded numbers, estimates of the dead, names of commanders, symbols of banners. The experience of the common soldier, the smell of blood, the weight of a soaked gambeson, those details were not recorded. History, after all, is often written by those who watched from a distance. Yet in parish records and household accounts, hints remain. A man named John Altwood in Kent received a tax exemption for injury taken at Shrewsbury. A letter survives, in the archives, from a widow requesting restitution, claiming her husband died fighting under Hotspur's banner and had left 3 children. Small fragments like these, mundane and bureaucratic, offer glimpses of the human toll. Bureaucratic, offer glimpses of the human toll. The battle also reshaped power. With the rebellion crushed, King Henry IV's position was briefly strengthened. But distrust remained. The nobility had seen how quickly alliances could shift. The Percy family, once trusted, had nearly unseated him. He now ruled a kingdom still fractious, still divided between loyalty and ambition. The common people, meanwhile, absorbed the consequences without say or reward. Tactically, the Battle of Shrewsbury was significant for one reason above all. It proved the effectiveness of longbowmen against heavily armed knights. The myth of cavalry dominance was shaken. Archers, seen as lowly before, were now feared. Other commanders took note. At Agincourt, just 12 years later, the longbow would again determine the course of battle. War, it seemed, was becoming more about strategy and positioning than chivalric glory. But strategy did not help the widows, or the orphans, or the men who lost hands and eyes and livelihoods. Medieval warfare had no rehabilitation programs, no pensions, no structured recovery. Veterans returned to fields, to taverns, to silence. Some became highwaymen or mercenaries. Others faded into village life, never speaking of what they had done. We may never know their names. Even the landscape itself remembered. For years after, farmers turned up arrowheads in the soil, bits of rusted chainmail, the occasional skull. Local lore grew around the site. A patch of earth where grass grew differently, a strange smell after rain. Children dared each other to touch the old tree. Near the burial trench, the dead, it seemed, lingered. And perhaps this is the real lesson of medieval battle. It was never clean, never noble. It was confusion, mud, blood, noise, and then silence. Those who survived rarely saw themselves as heroes. They were lucky, perhaps, or cursed. The reasons for fighting, honor, loyalty, rebellion, were quickly lost beneath the urgent facts of hunger, wounds, and fear. Even now, over 600 years later, when we visit a site like Shrewsbury, what do we remember? The commanders. Names? The political stakes? Or do we pause and wonder what it felt like to be a peasant standing barefoot in the mud, holding a spear made from farm tools, heart pounding, waiting for the first arrow to fall? The hidden life of a Victorian servant. It always started with the bell, a sharp metallic clang that echoed through the servants' quarters before the sun even considered rising. The wake-up bell, rung by the butler or head housemaid, marked the beginning of another long and silent day. You were not meant to be heard. You were not meant to be seen. But you had to do everything. In the Victorian era, grand houses were engines of silent labor. Behind the polished banisters, the velvet curtains, and the glimmering dinner services lay a complex, human machinery made up of servants, hundreds of thousands of them, across Britain, who operated within a world of rigid hierarchy, relentless, routine, and near invisibility. This was the domestic underclass that kept the empire's drawing rooms tidy and its soup warm. A servant's day could begin as early as 4:30 a.m., depending on their role. If you were a scullery maid, the lowest of the low, you were up first, your hands already in cold water before others opened their eyes. Your first job, lighting the kitchen range. That meant trudging outside for coal or wood, scraping out ashes from the night before, and carefully coaxing fire back into the stove's iron belly. No warmth yet for yourself. Gloves were not part of the uniform. Above stairs, the household slumbered in feather beds. Below stairs, the air was different, thicker, dustier, closer. Narrow hallways and shared dormitories housed the servants. These weren't cozy rooms but communal bunks or stiff single beds, each occupied by someone who had little privacy and no possessions beyond their uniforms, and perhaps a single photo or book. Speaking too loudly could earn a reprimand. Waking late could earn dismissal. The social structure among servants mimicked the larger class divisions. There were hierarchies within hierarchies. At the top stood the butler, a silent figure of authority, who managed the wine, the plate, the household silver, and the other male staff. In the most prestigious homes, he was addressed as Mr., a rare form of respect for a servant. Just below him, the housekeeper managed the female staff. She held the keys to the pantry and linen cupboards. Her ledger books were sacred. Beneath them were the footmen, prized for appearance, height, and posture. They wore livery, tight-fitting uniforms with brass buttons, and were often chosen for their looks as much as their skills. Footmen served meals, opened doors, and rode on the back of carriages visible to the world. But they were not free. They had curfews and were fined for scuffed boots. A scratch on a silver tray could cost them a week's wages. Then came the maids, ladies' maids, parlor maids, housemaids, laundry maids, and nursery maids. Each had distinct duties, strict schedules, and very little overlap. The ladies' maid served the mistress of the house directly, dressing her, curling her hair, managing her wardrobe. It was a position of privilege but also intense pressure. One misstep with a comb or corset could end in disgrace. The cook was another powerful figure, often feared in the basement world. A good cook could demand a high wage and rule the kitchen with iron discipline. They planned menus, managed supplies, and directed undercooks and scullery maids like a military officer. But even cooks were still servants, subject to the whims of the family upstairs. A dish returned untouched could ruin a reputation. Daily tasks were endless. Housemaids dusted and swept and emptied chamber pots. Water had to be fetched, fires tended, boots polished. The laundry, perhaps the most grueling work of all, required soaking, boiling, scrubbing, starching, and ironing, all without the benefit of running hot water or electric machines. Clean linens were essential in Victorian homes, and they did not clean themselves. Meals for the family were events. Breakfast at 8:30, luncheon at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 7. Each required staging, place settings, polishing, service, clearance. Servants ate separately, quickly and simply. Their meals might consist of porridge, bread crusts, and leftover meats. The butler might get sherry. The scullery maid, dry crusts and cold water. You had to move quickly but quietly. The sound of shoes on floorboards was discouraged. Footmen and maids often practiced walking without making noise. Even sneezing was something to be stifled, and you were never ever to be seen without being summoned. A hallway crossing timed incorrectly could lead to disciplinary notes or even termination. Free time? There was little. A half-day off per week was considered generous. Some servants, especially those in cities like London, used that half-day to walk, visit family, or attend church. But many simply slept. Others might read the Bible, penny newspapers, or serial novels. Books were often shared and well-worn. Some secretly wrote diaries. Others never learned to write at all. The rules were endless. No fraternizing, no borrowing, no lateness. Female servants were dismissed immediately if they became pregnant, regardless of the circumstances. Male servants had more leeway but were expected to maintain appearances. Everything depended on reputation and discretion. The wrong look, the wrong tone, the wrong letter left out could bring ruin. And yet, it wasn't always misery. There were friendships. Some servants found comfort in camaraderie, in shared jokes whispered in the scullery, or in the quiet smiles exchanged over the ironing board. There was pride, too. Pride in a perfectly arranged table, a shirt starched just so, a fire lit just before the master awoke. For many, being in service offered stability, better than the uncertainty of factory work or agricultural life. Children sometimes grew up in service, following a parent or aunt into the same house. Others worked for decades and received small pensions upon retirement. A very few even rose in status, housekeepers who became trusted confidants or butlers who managed estates during wartime absences. But these were exceptions. Most lived their lives in quiet obedience, always in the background. In public, they were invisible. Even in portraits of great houses, servants were rarely depicted. When they were, it was as symbols, a nameless figure, holding a tray, smoothing a hem, or standing by a horse. Their lives were only noticed when something went wrong. And then, of course, there was night. After dinner service, after dishes were cleared and silver was polished and fires were checked, the day finally ended. But not for all. The hall boy, often a teenage boy, stayed awake until the last gentleman went to bed. He might have to shine boots for the morning or bring a late-night drink. Sleep, for him, came in stolen hours. So you return to your tiny bed in the servants' quarters. You remove your apron, rinse your raw hands in cold water, and crawl under the rough blanket. You might think of home or nothing at all. The bell will ring again soon enough, and you wonder, what did it feel like to serve a family so completely that your own name barely mattered? To give your youth, your body, your thoughts to an upstairs world that barely noticed you were there? The household upstairs functioned like a well-rehearsed performance, and below stairs, you were part of the silent stage crew. Every action had its place. Every moment was filled with purpose until it wasn't. Because in the stillness, in the shadows, you might notice something stirring. A small act of defiance, a misstep in protocol, or even a secret kept behind locked cupboard doors. By the late Victorian period, around the 1880s and 1890s, domestic service was the single largest form of employment in Britain. Nearly 1.5 million people were engaged in household labor. The ideal was order, hierarchy, and unchanging tradition, but the reality was often more complex. The houses were not always stable, the rules not always fair, and the servants not always obedient. Rules, for one, governed everything. Some were posted on the walls of servant halls. Others were passed down by word of mouth. Do not speak unless spoken to. No visitors in quarters. Never look the master directly in the eye. But rules bent under pressure. A hallway. Glance became a brief smile. A stolen crust of cake disappeared in a maid's apron. A letter from a footman to a housemaid was hidden behind loose bricks in the scullery wall. Rituals were everywhere. Rituals of appearance, sound, and scent. Parlor maids were taught how to knock before entering a room. Not once, not twice, but a firm 3 taps. Too soft, and it was suspicious. Too hard, and it was rude. Even polishing brass had a ritual, left to right, always ending with a diagonal rub. Rituals were meant to preserve the illusion of control, even if chaos reigned just beneath the surface. Uniforms, too, had meaning. A footman's livery with its gleaming buttons and powdered hair was part theater, part restraint. Maids wore black dresses with white aprons and caps, the symbols of cleanliness, order, and anonymity. The clothing served to erase personality and signal role, but even here there were subtle ways to push back. Some added a hidden ribbon in a favorite color under their collar. Others stitched initials into seams, private names inside public roles. There were divisions among the servants themselves, and tension sometimes simmered. A lady's maid might view a scullery maid as beneath her. The butler might scold the footmen for being late to morning duties. The kitchen staff, hot and overworked, often resented the relative elegance of the drawing room servants, but despite these internal hierarchies, they were all aware of their shared status, outsiders inside a wealthy home. Courtship within the servant class was a delicate, risky dance. Most large households discouraged relationships among staff. But when young people live and work together in close quarters with little free time and fewer options, human nature finds a way. Silent glances over the dinner bell, brief conversations when changing linens, or the exchange of notes tucked into coal bins. These were the beginnings of many romances, and consequences could be severe. If a maid became pregnant, she was dismissed, without reference. Her partner, if discovered, might lose his position too. Discretion was everything. Victorian society valued appearance over substance, silence over honesty. You could clean the mistress's undergarments but were never to speak of them. You might witness a visiting gentleman leave a married woman's chamber late at night, but you never breathed a word. Gossip was dangerous but inevitable. The servants' hall, with its worn benches and shared pots of tea, became a quiet newsroom of the house's undercurrents. Still, discretion was what earned longevity in a position. And for many, longevity was survival. There were letters, thousands of them, exchanged between siblings in service across the country. Many servants had come from rural villages, some from Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. Letters were lifelines, read in stolen moments between scrubbing or sweeping. They contained news of births and funerals, illnesses and hopes. Sometimes a letter simply reminded a tired housemaid that she had once had a name beyond Sarah the upstairs girl. Discipline could be severe. Fines were common, small amounts, deducted from already tiny wages for breaking a cup or damaging fabric. A single pair of gloves lost by a footman might cost him a month's tips. Some households locked the pantry or rationed tea and sugar as punishment. Others dismissed staff for infractions as minor as giggling in a hallway. Servants had little recourse. References, the short notes of recommendation required for future employment, could be withheld or poisoned by innuendo. Not all houses were cruel. In more progressive homes, some employers treated servants with dignity and respect. They offered better meals, holidays, or the rare gift of a book. But even in these houses, the gulf between classes was rarely crossed. You might spend 10 years dressing your employer's hair without ever seeing her bedroom in daylight. The contradictions were constant. Servants were expected to be both invisible and omnipresent. They should anticipate the master's needs, yet never presume. They kept the home spotless, yet could not sit in its drawing rooms. They worked 14-hour days to make leisure possible for others. For the upper class, the servant class was a kind of convenience, a moral performance of status, order, and empire. Technology began to shift the rhythm of this world. The introduction of gaslighting meant later dinners and more cleaning. Mechanical carpet sweepers reduced some physical strain but created new expectations of perfection. Bells, those insistent jangling wires that connected the family's whims to the servants' time, became increasingly complex. A ring in the parlor could trigger a small flag to drop in the hallway panel, color-coded by room. It was a kind of code, a visual language of expectation, response, and silence. What did it feel like to respond to that bell again and again? You might wonder, standing at the servants' entrance, coat wet with rain and hands red from scrubbing. If your life mattered in the grand scheme of things, you might wonder if the young master remembered your name, or if the mistress noticed that you ironed the tablecloth twice today because she seemed agitated. For many, there were dreams of leaving. Some saved wages and moved to smaller towns, opened tea shops or found work in shops and dressmaking. Others took passage to Canada or Australia, hoping for new starts. But most remained in service for decades, aging quietly in the houses they had once cleaned as girls or polished as boys. And still, there were moments of joy. A quiet laugh in the pantry, the rare compliment from a cook, the feel of fresh sheets on a summer afternoon. There were whispered songs in the laundry room and dances held below stairs on Christmas night. There were birthdays marked with stolen biscuits and a single candle. There was life, even there, in the quietest corners of the Victorian house. But what happened when the house itself began to fade? When fortunes turned, when sons left for war, when new technologies replaced human labor? The bell still rang, but not as often. The great house stood as it always had, its stone exterior weathered, its long windows casting patterned light across empty hallways. But if you listened carefully, the rhythm had changed. Fewer footsteps on the stair, fewer hands to dust the chandeliers, fewer voices around the iron range. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world of the Victorian servant was beginning to fade. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The decline of domestic service was gradual. Like a carriage, slowing to a stop long before you realize the driver has let go of the reins. But it started for many with the wars. The First World War took more than lives, it took the future. It took the sons and daughters of laborers, seamstresses, and tenant farmers, many of whom might have entered service. Instead, they served elsewhere, in trenches and field hospitals, in munitions factories and naval ports. The war shifted priorities. It offered, for some, a taste of independence. When the war ended, something had changed. A generation had seen the world outside great houses. They had nursed officers and fired artillery. They had driven ambulances and written official ledgers, and many did not wish to return to a life of polishing spoons in silence. The economics of domestic service also began to falter. Maintaining a large household staff was expensive. Taxes increased. Agricultural rents, once the lifeblood of landed estates, declined. Some families sold their townhomes or leased country properties to industrialists. Others reduced staff. A house that once required 30 servants might now make do with 10, or 5, or none. New technologies accelerated the shift. Electric lighting eliminated the need for lamplighters and nightly maintenance of gas systems. Central heating reduced the number of fires needing daily tending. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and modern stoves made some labor redundant, though the technology often arrived in servant quarters last, if at all. Still, the promise was clear, a home that needed fewer hands. For the servants themselves, choices began to appear, slowly, cautiously. Young women could become typists, shopgirls, teachers. Men might work in factories or drive delivery trucks. The pay was not always better, but the hours were, and so was the freedom. A milliner might earn less than a housemaid but enjoy weekends and a front door of her own. Still, for some, the pull of the great house remained strong. For the older generation, those who had spent decades folding linens and ironing waistcoats, the decline was bittersweet. Their identities were shaped by service. They knew every creak of the floorboards, every shade of the family's moods. A dismissal or redundancy felt like erasure. What were you, if not the one who always lit the drawing room fire at 4? Some stayed on as reduced staff. A housekeeper became both cleaner and cook. A retired butler returned part-time to maintain the cellar. These were not the rigidly stratified roles of the Victorian heyday, but hybrid positions born of necessity and loyalty. Sometimes the relationship softened too. Longtime staff were called by their first names. Former maids received letters from now-grown children they had once minded. There was a kind of strange familiarity between classes that had never before spoken plainly to one another. In country estates that survived the transitions, service changed but did not disappear entirely. The interwar period saw what some called the last golden age of British domestic service. It was no longer the dominant employer, but it was still a respectable profession for many. Uniforms remained, bells still rang, but the tone had shifted. Footmen were fewer, but parlor maids endured. The largest houses adapted, offering shorter hours or letting staff marry and remain employed, once an unthinkable policy. Then came the Second World War, and with it, another rupture. Country houses were requisitioned for hospitals, military, training, and evacuation centers. Families moved out. Servants joined the war effort or relocated to cities. The rhythm of domestic life was disrupted once again, and this time it didn't return. After 1945, Britain changed rapidly. The welfare state expanded education, health, and housing. Council flats and civil service jobs opened new paths for the working class. The idea of entering service, once automatic for many girls at age 14, now seemed outdated. The profession didn't vanish entirely, but it transformed. Daily help replaced live-in maids. Housekeepers became managers. The age of the boer, silent bell was over. And what of those who had once lived that life? Many aged quietly into retirement, their stories mostly unrecorded. A few wrote memoirs, sparse and unembellished. Others faded into nursing homes or modest lodgings, surrounded by faded photographs of other people's homes. Some had children who never knew of the years spent folding gowns in candlelit rooms or walking 5 miles to fetch fresh cream at dawn. Historians now attempt to piece together their world through servants' ledgers, employment records, cookbooks, and letters. A torn apron in a museum, a brass bell display, a diary hidden behind wallpaper, all reminders that the world upstairs depended entirely on the world downstairs. There is a peculiar sadness in how the servant class disappeared without ceremony. No parades marked their departure. No monuments stand to honor the countless women and men who scrubbed, cooked, and carried through lifetimes of silence. Yet in many ways they built the Victorian world. One polish, one stitch, one breathless dash up the back stairs at a time. You might wonder what they dreamed about. After the work was done, when the floors gleamed and the fires burned low, and they rested in their narrow cots, what did they imagine for themselves? A home of their own? A warm meal at a quiet table? A name perhaps spoken without a title? They were the invisible hands behind the velvet curtains, and though the house stands quieter now, the memory of their quiet labor lingers, stitched into the folds of time. Shoes in the age of plague. What cobblers knew about survival. You might not think of shoes first when imagining the great plagues of Europe. You may picture masks with beaked noses, wagons carrying the dead, or the quiet terror. They crept from door to door, but in the margins of those familiar images, closer to the ground and almost always unnoticed, someone was repairing the city's shoes. The cobbler's shop was not in the center of town. It was not grand. It was narrow, sometimes windowless, tucked behind taverns or beside alleyways where chickens pecked at scraps. The smell was unmistakable, leather soaked in tannins, glue brewed from animal hooves, smoke from a small hearth. There, bent over a low bench, sat a man, often old before his time, hands hardened and fingers stained, cutting, stitching, tapping. He made no headlines, he recorded no sermons, but he walked through every chapter of plague and survival with quiet regularity. In 14th century Europe, when the Black Death arrived like a dark wind, cobblers were among those who continued to work. While priests collapsed at altars and merchants fled with their goods, cobblers stayed. Their trade was essential even in death. Gravediggers needed boots. Carters who hauled the corpses wore through their souls quickly. Those who traveled, nurses, letter carriers, food sellers, needed new shoes to replace those worn down on filthy streets. And those fleeing towns altogether often came knocking, hoping for something durable to carry them toward rumored safety. The cobbler's skill was deeply practical. He worked with awls, knives, waxed thread, and blocks of oak or ash called lasts, wooden forms carved in the shape of a human foot. Each shoe was made by hand. There were no factories, no standard sizes. A wealthy patron might have boots fitted precisely to his arch, while a peasant would take what was available. But even the simplest shoes required knowledge passed down through apprenticeship: how to soften hide, when to trim the edge, how to stitch to prevent blistering. Leather was not easy to come by. Good hides came from cattle that had lived long, enough to grow strong. But during plague years, animals were often slaughtered in haste. Leather was sometimes improperly cured, leading to cracking or stink. Cobblers had to adapt, working with flawed material, sometimes even repurposing older shoes, salvaging souls from the dead to make serviceable footwear for the living. Shoes told stories. A cobbler could read them like books. A heavily worn heel meant a limp or imbalance. Worn toes suggested a person who crouched often, perhaps a weaver or a farmhand. Sharp cracks and splits in the upper leather might indicate someone walking through wet fields or along salted roads. Each shoe was a biography in miniature, a worn-out testament to where someone had been and what they had endured. In plague years, these stories changed. Cobblers began to notice different wear patterns. More shoes arrived blood-stained or stiff with what had once been mud, now dusted with white salt from drying fevered bodies. Fewer shoes came in pairs. Someone would bring in a single boot. "My brother died," they might say. "Can you fix this one?" Not to wear, but to bury. Demand for repairs rose. but demand for new shoes sometimes plummeted. The population fell so sharply, sometimes by as much as 50% in a town, that cobblers, like many other tradesmen, found themselves surrounded by stillness. Workshops that had once rung with hammer taps were silent. Journeymen stopped traveling. Apprentices vanished. Those who survived carried on, their benches as empty as the streets outside. And yet the cobbler was essential in a less obvious way. Not only did he keep people walking, he also served as a kind of local chronicler. People talked in the cobbler's shop. They stood awkwardly as he measured or fitted them, recounting who had died, who had fled, which roads were safe. It was a crossroads of whispered information. Without newspapers, without consistent clergy or officials, tradespeople like cobblers were nodes of community memory. They kept no records, but they remembered. Some cobblers also made plague shoes, strange, clumsy creations designed to protect the wearer. These might have thick, elevated soles meant to keep one's feet from touching the infected ground. Some were lined with herbs or stuffed with dried flowers, based on the prevailing belief that bad smells caused disease. Others were fashioned with waxed linings or were burned after a single use. None of it worked. But in the absence of certainty, people clung to whatever protection they could imagine. The cobbler saw death often, but he also saw what came next. Rebirth was quieter. As towns rebuilt and fields were reclaimed, as children played in alleys again, cobblers were among the first to return to a kind of normal. Their work, always steady and necessary, became one of the first signs that life was resuming. A boy needed shoes for his new job at the market. A widow brought in her husband's boots to be resized for her son. Life pressed forward, and so did the leather soles that carried it. In some cases, cobblers grew modestly wealthy after the plague, especially in towns where many competitors had died. Labor was scarce, and surviving tradesmen could charge higher rates. Some even moved into larger shops, took on new apprentices, and raised their prices. But most did not rise far. The cobbler was still considered lower class, closer to the tannery than the tailor. His hands smelled of lye and glue. His tools were simple. His fame, if it came, was accidental. Yet the cobbler endured. Through waves of plague and fire, through famine and war, he remained a fixture in nearly every community. In this way, he was more reliable than many of history's celebrated figures. Kings fled cities during outbreaks. Nobles died in exile. But the cobbler stayed. His shop remained open, and through him others kept walking. We do not know most of their names. Their benches have long since rotted, their tools rusted into earth. The shoes they made, fragile and overused, have turned to dust. But in rare cases, archaeologists find them. Shoes buried with plague victims, curled and crumbling, stitched in ways still recognizable. Some even bear faint maker's marks, a scratched initial, a carved symbol, proof that someone once cared enough to craft something well, even in the shadow of death. You might ask yourself, what did the cobbler think about late at night when the streets were quiet and the air was heavy with the scent of illness? Did he wonder if his work mattered? Did he believe in the protection his shoes offered? Or was he simply focused on the task at hand, the next stitch, the next sole, the next set of feet that needed to keep moving? Shoemaking was, by all appearances, a simple craft, yet it stood at the crossroads of medicine, survival, and social order during Europe's recurring plagues. If the first wave of the Black Death in the 14th century felt like a thunderclap, the succeeding centuries delivered its rumbling echo. Outbreaks returned again and again, in 1361, 1374, 1400, and well beyond. And in each of those times, cobblers quietly resumed their work. The patterns of plague changed over time. In some towns it would last only weeks, in others, months. But the shoes always came. Footwear wore out no matter what illness threatened. In fact, it wore out faster in chaos. When roads became overused with fleeing families or when men were pressed into municipal service, collecting bodies, digging trenches, or enforcing quarantine, Boots cracked, heels split, and soles separated from uppers. Cobblers became, ironically, the linchpin of movement at a time when so much tried to stay still. For a 15th century cobbler, the rhythm of work varied not only by plague, but by geography. In Florence, Paris, or London, the trade was often regulated by guilds, structured systems of labor that dictated how many cobblers could work in a town, what materials they could use, and who could apprentice. These guilds helped maintain a certain level of quality, but they also enforced hierarchy. A master cobbler owned a workshop. A journeyman traveled to find work. An apprentice learned slowly, bound by contract for years in exchange for room, board, and skill. In rural villages or poorer towns, these distinctions blurred. Shoemaking was often a side trade, a job done between harvesting and mending tools, or during the long winters when farming paused. Some families passed the knowledge down informally. A father might teach his son how to shape a last or stitch a welt. These shoes were often cruder, but no less vital, especially during plague years, when travel was restricted and cities feared. Outsiders, local cobblers kept people clothed and moving. The plague didn't only reshape demand, it reshaped the business itself. Take, for example, the role of women in shoemaking. Before the 14th century, women were largely excluded from cobbler guilds. Yet as mortality rates climbed and entire male lineages were extinguished, necessity forced the rules to bend. Widows took over their husbands' shops. Daughters inherited tools. Some women made shoes out of sight. Unofficially, their work passed off under male names. Others eventually carved out a legitimate place in the trade, though rarely acknowledged in official guild records. In times of upheaval, rigidity softened. Quietly, the trade diversified. The cobbler's materials, too, began to shift. In the Yakyar early days, the best shoes used cowhide tanned with oak bark in long, smelly baths that took weeks. But with the labor force decimated and livestock herds thinned by neglect, supply changed. Leather came from goats, pigs, even dogs in desperate times. Some cobblers experimented with felt or wool-bound uppers stitched to salvaged soles. Reuse became common. A cobbler might receive a mismatched set of worn boots and salvage enough leather to cobble together something wearable. In plague years, function eclipsed form. And yet, amid this pragmatism, there remained surprising beauty. Some cobblers still decorated their shoes, not lavishly, but with stitched patterns, scalloped leather edges, or colored dyes rubbed into seams. Perhaps it was tradition, perhaps it was habit, or perhaps it was a small act of resistance, proof that life had not entirely given way to despair. Even in towns heavy with death, a child might still wear shoes with bright red threads, or a widow might request floral embossing on the boots she commissioned for burial. Cobblers also became unintentional observers of health. They noticed changes before physicians did because they saw the feet. Feet told the truth. When people grew weaker, they walked differently. Their arches collapsed. They dragged their soles. Swelling showed up first in the toes. Some cobblers learned to recognize the early signs of plague or malnutrition before others noticed. They became, in their own way, diagnosticians, though they had no Latin terms or academic robes. And of course, they handled risk. Constantly. Leather was cut from the hides of recently butchered animals, which could carry disease. Clients often arrived coughing, trembling, or too ill to speak. Money passed hands covered in filth. Shoes brought in for repair might still be warm from a dead owner. To survive, cobblers adopted quiet precautions, airing out shoes in the sun, burning scrap, leather, rubbing hands with vinegar. They didn't understand bacteria, but experience taught caution. In some cities, municipal authorities recognized this danger. Orders were issued to fumigate or burn shoes taken from plague victims, but enforcement was rare and uneven. More often, cobblers developed their own informal rituals, wearing gloves, keeping separate bins for infected goods, or simply refusing service. Yet few could afford to refuse too many clients. They walked the line between caution and hunger every day. There were quiet consequences for those who didn't survive. A cobbler's bench might sit untouched, covered in dust. Tools would rust in place. Sometimes neighbors would salvage them, starting a new business from the remnants of the old. In tight-knit communities, apprentices might take over their master's shop and name. In this way, the trade preserved itself, through the objects, left behind as much as the skills passed down. Then there were the wandering cobblers, journeymen who moved from town to town searching for work. Their job was hard even in good times. During plague, it was perilous. They faced suspicion, travel bans, and isolation. But in isolated villages desperate for shoes and cut off from supply lines, these cobblers were welcomed. Some became semi-permanent fixtures in new communities. Others disappeared, their names and fates unknown, their work left behind in worn soles and uneven stitches. By the 17th century, as new plague outbreaks swept through Europe, especially in London, where the Great Plague of 1665 took an estimated 100,000 lives, the cobbler's presence had become almost assumed. His shop was part of the urban tapestry. Even as fires razed whole districts and families were locked in their homes, the sound of hammering on a leather sole could still be heard. Steady, rhythmic, unfazed by panic. Cobblers didn't write memoirs. Their literacy rates were low. They did not debate theology or politics, but their impact was physical, literal. They kept people walking, toward hospitals, toward ships, away from quarantine zones, or back to the market after months of silence. Their shoes carried messengers with orders and mothers with feverish children. They bore witness not through words, but through wear. Even after the plague years faded, the echoes of that time lived on in the trade. Future shoemakers inherited not just tools but habits, rituals of cleaning, customs of reuse, and a quiet understanding that their work, though humble, touched lives in fragile moments. A well-made pair of shoes might not save a life, but it could carry someone safely to the place where help waited, and it raises a question, one you can't answer just by reading history. How much did the cobbler know? In the moments between measurements, did he realize he was keeping the world walking? Or did he see only the scuffed soles and leather scraps before him, unaware that his quiet trade was part of the machinery that helped life resume, step by slow step? The centuries that followed the Great Plagues transformed Europe in countless ways. Cities grew, trade expanded, and medicine slowly advanced. But one quiet legacy remained. The cobbler's craft, shaped and hardened by survival amid crisis, carried forward the imprint of lives lived in uncertainty. The shoes that cobblers made were more than simple objects. They were vessels of resilience, of continuity, and sometimes of hope. By the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to change the world. Machines could now produce shoes, faster than any hand could stitch. Factories lined the outskirts of growing cities, turning out standardized footwear for armies, workers, and citizens alike. Yet even as machines multiplied output, the handcrafted shoe retained a kind of soul. Cobblers persisted, particularly in rural areas and poorer neighborhoods, where the factory-made shoe was too expensive or ill-fitting. Their work remained, rooted in traditions forged in plague years, the repair, the reuse, the attention to individual feet. What is striking, when you look back, is how much cobblers embodied an unspoken form of social infrastructure. When official governments faltered, when churches lost authority, when sickness isolated families, cobblers and other tradespeople maintained the flow of daily life. They helped keep cities habitable. They carried people forward, quite literally. In fact, some historians argue that the survival of ordinary trades, shoemakers, butchers, bakers, was as critical to the rebuilding of post-plague societies as any army or king. Without them, recovery might have faltered, slowed by the practical realities of clothing and movement. Shoes were necessary to farm the fields, to go to market, to attend church, to rebuild homes. The cobbler's craft was not glamorous, but it was foundational. There are records of guilds petitioning local authorities to recognize the essential nature of their work during times of crisis. Cobblers were exempted from certain travel bans so they could continue to supply soldiers and officials. In some places, cobblers joined municipal councils or took on roles in public health initiatives, such as overseeing the disposal of contaminated materials. Their position had quietly shifted from humble craftsperson to community pillar. It is fascinating to consider the cobbler's perspective on disease and health. Though medicine was primitive by modern standards, many tradespeople, cobblers included, had their own folk wisdom. They understood the importance of cleanliness before it was scientifically proven. They knew to air out shoes and to avoid contact with infected hides. They developed routines like smoking leather or dipping soles in tar, not always effective but born of careful observation and survival instinct, and their knowledge extended beyond health. Cobblers had to adapt to changing fashions, economic fluctuations, and shifting social norms. In the 15th century, pointed toes were in vogue. By the 16th century, the wide-heeled duckbill shoe emerged. Cobblers had to adjust their skills accordingly, balancing aesthetics with the practical demands of wear and tear. Each period left a fingerprint on the shoes of the time, which modern historians can read as cultural texts. The archaeological record, though sparse, confirms the endurance of this craft. Shoemakers' tools, knives, awls, lasts, have been found in plague burial sites, silently testifying to a life interrupted but not erased. Remnants of shoes, preserved in peat bogs or dry cellars, show a wide range of quality and style, reflecting the stratified societies they served. Some shoes are simple, patched, and functional. Others are finely stitched and decorated, hinting at owners who valued both comfort and appearance despite the hardships. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of the cobblers lies in their relationship to the people they served. Shoes carried bodies. Through grief and recovery, they bore the weight of labor and the promise of future journeys. They were present at moments of birth, marriage, and death, worn by children taking first steps, by soldiers marching to battle, by mourners walking to funerals. And yet, for all their significance, cobblers remained largely invisible in grand historical narratives. They are often footnotes or background characters in stories focused on kings, battles, or discoveries. But, if you pause and consider, you realize that without them, many of those stories might never have been told. Without shoes, the messengers could not ride, the farmers could not tend their fields, the pilgrims could not reach their shrines. It brings us to a quiet reflection. History is not just shaped by the famous and the powerful, but also by those who keep life moving in the smallest, most mundane ways. The cobbler's shop, with its simple bench and worn tools, was a sanctuary of continuity amid chaos. Its products were a testament to human resilience, the resolve to keep walking, to keep surviving, even when the world seemed to fall apart. As you think about the cobbler, in the age of plague, imagine the countless footsteps they mended. Each shoe was a lifeline, each stitch a silent act of hope. And as you slip your own shoes on, consider how much history rests beneath your soles. The unbroken chain of hands that crafted, repaired, and carried us through centuries of hardship and survival. What will your footsteps leave behind? How will the seemingly ordinary acts of your life echo into the future, shaping the world in ways you cannot yet see? The daily grind of a medieval baker. How bread shaped life and death. The morning in a medieval town often began with the smell of bread, warm, yeasty, and comforting. But for the baker, this smell was not merely a signal of fresh food. It was the result of a long, repetitive cycle of labor, precision, and unglamorous survival. Baking bread in the Middle Ages was far from the effortless chore it might seem to us today. It was a craft rooted deeply in the rhythms of life and death, shaped by the limits of technology, the fluctuations of harvest, and the hunger of a community that depended on the steady production of sustenance. In the modest bakery, small stone or timber building near the center of the village or town, the baker awoke hours before dawn. Unlike the slow and relaxed morning routines many enjoy today, the baker's day was dictated by the fire's readiness and the fermentation of the dough. Fire was both the heart and the danger of the bakery. The hearth was a simple construction, often a clay or brick oven with a wide mouth and a single chamber. It took hours to heat properly, and its temperature was controlled only by the skill of the baker, the kindling available, and the weather outside. The first task was to stoke the fire, adding wood, controlling airflow, and gauging the ovens. Heat by touch or by tossing in a small piece of dough to see how it browned. There were no thermometers or timers. It was a dance with intuition and experience. Too hot, and the bread would burn on the outside and remain raw inside. Too cold, and the dough would never fully bake, risking spoilage and sickness. Meanwhile, the baker prepared the dough. Flour was the core ingredient, but its quality varied dramatically depending on the harvest, the local grains, and the milling process. In many villages, the mill was a community resource, a water mill or windmill that processed the grain. Flour could be coarse or fine, white or dark. White flour was a luxury, reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Most common folk ate bread made from rye or barley, resulting in a dense, heavy loaf. Mixing dough was a simple yet essential act. Flour, water, sometimes salt, and yeast, or naturally occurring wild yeasts. The baker would knead the dough, a physically demanding task that required strength and rhythm to ensure the mixture was smooth and elastic enough to rise properly. This process could take up to an hour or more, depending on the batch size and ambient temperature. Once kneaded, the dough was left to rise covered with a cloth or in a wooden trough, while the baker tended to other chores. Rising was unpredictable, affected by the humidity, temperature, and the health of the yeast culture. A failed rise could mean wasted flour and hungry mouths. As the dough grew, the baker shaped it into loaves, rolls, or flatbreads, sometimes marking them with distinctive slashes or stamps to indicate ownership or type. In some towns, bakers were required by law to mark their bread, both for quality control and taxation. With the fire at its peak, the loaves were placed inside the oven on wooden paddles or directly on the stone floor. The baking time varied but was generally around 30 minutes to an hour. The baker had to monitor closely, often using his ear to listen for the subtle crackling or his nose for the faint changes in aroma. While the bread baked, the baker prepared for the next batch or cleaned the tools, wooden boards, knives, paddles, working in the dusty, flour-covered environment that could cause coughs and irritations. There was little respite from this cycle, especially during times of high demand, such as market days, religious festivals, or harsh winters when bread was the primary source of calories. Bread was more than food. It was currency, social glue, and a barometer of community well-being. For peasants, bread was survival. For the urban poor, it was daily sustenance. For the nobility, fine white loaves signified status and refinement. The baker's skill directly influenced public health. Bad bread could cause illness, while stale or moldy loaves were common hazards. The baker also faced legal oversight. In many medieval towns, strict laws governed the weight, price, and quality of bread. Bakers were inspected regularly, and punishments for cheating customers ranged from fines to public humiliation. This system reflected the bread's vital importance. Too much fluctuation could lead to unrest, starvation, or economic collapse. And then, there were the darker moments, years when the harvest failed, grain prices soared, and the baker's shelves grew empty. Bread riots were not uncommon. When bread disappeared, the very fabric of society threatened to unravel. The baker was caught between the grain producers, the hungry populace, and the often harsh demands of rulers who saw bread as a symbol of order. So the baker's day was a constant balancing act, between fire and flour, between scarcity and plenty, between toil and tradition. The rhythm of kneading and baking, of waiting and watching, echoed the steady pulse of medieval life itself. It was a life shaped by routine, shaped by survival, and shaped by a simple loaf that bore the weight of history. And as the baker pulled the first golden loaves from the oven and laid them out to cool, a question remained lingering in the warm air. In a world where bread meant so much, how many lives depended on a single baker's skill? And how often did failure mean far more than just an empty stomach? The medieval baker's work didn't begin and end within the walls of the bakery. Behind every loaf was an intricate network of labor and logistics that tied together peasants, millers, merchants, and sometimes even rulers. The steady production of bread was less about a single craftsman's skill and more about a delicate supply chain that sustained entire communities, and sometimes entire kingdoms. Grain was the raw material of bread. and its journey from field to table was shaped by the rhythms of agriculture, weather, and politics. Most grain came from peasant farmers who worked small plots under feudal obligations. The growing season was unpredictable. Too much rain could drown crops. Too little meant drought and famine. Harvesting required entire villages to come together in a communal effort to reap, bind, and store sheaves before the winter frost. Once harvested, grain had to be dried and stored carefully to prevent spoilage or infestation by pests. Grain storage was often the responsibility of local lords or monasteries, which held granaries and barns designed to protect against rodents and moisture. Losses were common, however, and in some years, much of the harvest never made it past storage. The grain then made its way to the mill. Mills were essential hubs in medieval society, often controlled by the local lord who exacted a milling toll, a percentage of the grain ground into flour. Watermills were common in wetter regions, while windmills appeared in areas with suitable conditions, though they were technologically simpler and less widespread before the late Middle Ages. Milling was a noisy and dusty business, and the quality of the flour depended on the skill of the miller and the condition of the millstones. Coarser flour was cheaper and often all that peasants could afford, while finer white flour was reserved for the nobility or the wealthy urban classes. For the baker, access to a reliable supply of flour was essential. During times of scarcity, due to war, bad harvests, or disease, grain prices could soar, leading to bread shortages and social unrest. Bread riots were a grim reminder of how tightly the survival of society hinged on this staple food. The distribution of bread was another, complex matter. In larger towns, bakers often sold their bread directly from their shops or stalls in marketplaces. Some towns had communal ovens where villagers brought their own dough to be baked, an arrangement that conserved firewood and reduced the risk of accidental fires. In rural areas, bread might be baked at home, but the baker still played a role in supplying those who could not bake themselves. Bread was so important that it even became a form of currency or payment. Bakers might receive grain, labor, or services in exchange for their bread. In monasteries and large estates, baking was often part of a broader system of provisioning the inhabitants and guests. The social role of the baker was significant. Bakers were often among the more stable and respected tradespeople in their communities, especially in towns with guilds that regulated the craft. These guilds set standards for quality, pricing, and training, helping maintain public trust in the essential product of bread. Yet despite this structure, the baker's life was precarious. Illness, fires, poor harvests, or political upheaval could disrupt the entire supply chain, threatening the livelihood of the baker and the survival of the community. In times of famine or siege, bread became scarce or rationed, and bakers sometimes became scapegoats for wider social tensions. The cycle of grain growing, milling, baking, and selling was a fragile ecosystem, one easily upset by forces beyond the baker's control. But it was also a system of resilience, where communities adapted, shared resources, and kept the ovens warm even in the darkest times. As you imagine the journey of a single loaf, from the furrows of a distant field, through the mills grinding, stones to the baker's hands, and finally to the table, you see more than just food. You see the interconnected lives and efforts of countless individuals, each playing a vital role in the survival of the many. How many other everyday objects around us carry such hidden stories of survival and connection? And what can this tell us about the ways communities have always found to endure, even when the future feels uncertain? As we step into the final chapter of the medieval baker's story, it becomes clear that bread was more than just daily nourishment. It was a cornerstone of social order, economic stability, and even political power. The baker, often overlooked in grand histories of kings and wars, occupied a pivotal position where the everyday and the extraordinary collided. Bread was so vital that it became tightly woven into the fabric of law and governance. Town charters and royal edicts frequently included detailed regulations about the production and sale of bread. These rules were designed to ensure fair prices and consistent quality, but also to maintain peace. A shortage or perceived injustice in bread distribution could spark unrest or worse. Indeed, bread riots punctuate medieval history. When harvests failed or grain was hoarded, people's desperation often found expression in violent protests, with bakers sometimes targeted as symbols of scarcity or greed. Yet bakers were also victims, squeezed between rising grain prices and the demands of the community and authorities. Their livelihood depended on a delicate balance that was often threatened by forces beyond their control. The social significance of bread extended into religious and cultural life. In Christian Europe, bread took on sacred meaning in the Eucharist, symbolizing the body of Christ. This spiritual dimension elevated the humble loaf into something far greater, intertwining faith with daily survival. Bakers occasionally provided bread for churches and monasteries, where their craft supported rituals that brought communities together and offered hope amid hardship. Moreover, bakers and their guilds wielded quiet influence in towns. Guild halls were centers of social life, and membership offered protections, training, and economic opportunity. These organizations helped standardize the craft, resolve disputes, and advocate for members' interests with local rulers. In this way, bakers contributed to the gradual emergence of organized civil society. The physical space of the bakery itself was a hub of interaction, where customers exchanged news, bartered, or sought advice. Bakers often knew more about their communities than official records could show. Through their daily work, they bore witness to births, marriages, deaths, and conflicts, carrying the lived experience of their neighbors. Yet, for all their importance, the details of bakers' lives are often sparse in historical records. We glimpse them through court documents, guild registers, and rare personal accounts. But much remains lost to time. The labor, the skill, the small acts of resilience and care they practiced quietly shaped the course of history. In reflecting on the baker's world, one sees a portrait of endurance, not just of a craft, but of community. Bread connected the rural and urban, the rich and poor, the sacred and secular. It was a daily reminder of what people depended on and what they fought to protect. As you consider the legacy of medieval bakers, think about the many unseen hands and untold stories behind the simplest things we often take for granted. How might the survival and well-being of entire societies hinge on these ordinary, overlooked figures? And what lessons might their quiet resilience hold for us today, in a world still shaped by the supply chains and social bonds that sustain our lives? Daily life in a medieval monastery, routine, rules, and quiet survival. Imagine stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval monastery, leaving behind the noisy bustle of town or the quiet labor of the countryside. Inside these stone walls, time flows differently, governed by a rhythm both strict and slow, where every hour is marked by prayer, work, and study. For the monks who lived here, this was not just a place of worship, but a carefully structured community dedicated to survival, discipline, and a form of peace amid a chaotic medieval world. The day began very early, often before dawn. The first bell would ring, calling monks from their simple cells, small rooms barely larger than a modern closet, each containing a bed, a desk, and a shelf or two. These were places for solitary rest and reflection, but also humble confinement. Privacy was minimal, and the walls were cold and bare save for a small window letting in the faint light of the morning. The monks dressed in plain habits, robes of wool, often coarse and heavy, designed for modesty and practicality rather than comfort. Their shoes were sturdy but worn, suited for walking the stone floors and dirt paths within the monastery grounds. Before the sun rose, the monks gathered in the chapel for the first of the daily prayers, known as matins or vigils. This was a lengthy service, often lasting over an hour, performed in near darkness by candlelight or pre-dawn light filtering through stained glass. The chanting, sung in Latin, echoed off the stone walls, creating an atmosphere both solemn and meditative. For many, this was the spiritual anchor of the day, a moment to connect with God and prepare for the tasks ahead. After matins, the monks returned to their cells for a brief rest or to engage in private study. Soon they would convene again for lauds, another prayer service marking dawn and the beginning of active work. Work in the monastery was varied but always purposeful. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the guiding text for many monastic communities, prescribed a balance between ora et labora, prayer and work. This balance was seen as essential for spiritual health and community survival. Some monks tended gardens, growing vegetables, herbs, and flowers used for food, medicine, and religious rituals. Others worked in the scriptorium, meticulously copying manuscripts by hand. This was slow, painstaking work requiring concentration and steady hands, often by candlelight. The scribes preserved not only religious texts but also classical works of literature, philosophy, and science, safeguarding knowledge through turbulent times. There were also tasks like baking bread, brewing ale, cleaning, maintaining buildings, and caring for the sick and elderly monks. These duties were assigned based on ability and need, with the understanding that every contribution was valuable. Meals were simple and taken in silence, usually consisting of bread, vegetables, and sometimes fish or cheese. Meat was often forbidden or reserved for special occasions. Eating in silence reinforced contemplation and self-discipline, with conversation considered a distraction from spiritual focus. The daily schedule was punctuated by several more prayer services: prime, early morning; terce, mid-morning; sext, noon; none, mid-afternoon; vespers, evening; and compline, night. Each service involved chanting psalms, reading scripture, and communal reflection. Evenings were quiet. After compline, monks retired to their cells for rest, study, or meditation before the cycle began anew. The repetitive nature of these routines could seem monotonous or even harsh, but for many monks this structure provided meaning, stability, and a way to face the uncertainties of the outside world. Despite their cloistered life, monasteries were not entirely isolated. They often served as centers of charity, education, and healthcare for surrounding communities. Travelers and pilgrims might find shelter here, and monks sometimes acted as intermediaries in local disputes or advisors to nobles. Yet beneath the serene surface, challenges persisted: illness, scarcity of food, internal conflicts, and the ever-present task of maintaining the monastery's physical structures and spiritual discipline. The monks' survival depended on strict adherence to their routines and mutual support within their community. As you settle into the measured pace of a monk's day, you might wonder, how did this rigid life shape the individuals who lived it? And in what ways did the quiet endurance of monasteries influence the broader medieval world beyond their stone walls? As the monastery's daily rhythm carries on, it's easy to imagine a world of calm and order, a place removed from the messy realities outside. Yet beneath the surface of chants and chores lay a complex social fabric, where power, personality, and survival intertwined in subtle and sometimes surprising ways. Monasteries were communities first, and like any community, they had hierarchies and relationships that shaped life inside the walls. The abbot was the leader elected by the monks, responsible for guiding both spiritual and practical matters. His word was law, but his power was tempered by the rule of Saint Benedict, which demanded humility, fairness, and accountability. The abbot's daily tasks were as varied as any leaders today: managing resources, settling disputes, overseeing work assignments, and representing the monastery to outside authorities. Behind closed doors, the abbot might grapple with internal politics, balancing the needs and ambitions of different monks, each with their own personalities and strengths. Beneath the abbot, other roles included the prior, his deputy, cellarer, in charge of provisions, sacristan, responsible for the chapel and sacred objects, and infirmarian, who cared for the sick. These positions required a mix of spiritual dedication and practical skills, often given to monks trusted for their experience and reliability. Life within the community was governed not only by rules, but also by unwritten customs and personal dynamics. Conflicts arose sometimes over seemingly minor matters: a heated debate over who should sweep the floors, disagreements about prayer schedules, or tensions about the distribution of food. In a setting where silence and obedience were prized, such disputes could simmer quietly or occasionally erupt into open confrontation. The vow of poverty, a cornerstone of monastic life, meant that monks relinquished personal possessions. This created a shared environment where everything was communal, but it also could breed resentment or competition. especially when resources were scarce. Food shortages, harsh winters, or failed crops in monastery gardens could test the limits of charity and patience. Monks came from varied backgrounds. Some were sons of noble families, others were peasants seeking refuge or education, and a few joined later in life after years in the outside world. These differences shaped the community's social texture. Nobles might carry themselves differently or have more influence, while others struggled quietly to adapt to the strict discipline. Education was a significant aspect of monastic life. Many monks were literate, a rare skill in medieval society. The monastery school trained younger monks and sometimes local boys, teaching Latin, scripture, and basic arithmetic. The scriptorium preserved texts, but also generated knowledge, copying and sometimes creating manuscripts that reflected contemporary thought. Monastic scholars engaged in debates about theology, philosophy, and sometimes even natural science. These intellectual activities, while less visible than battlefield or court drama, were crucial to the preservation and development of medieval culture. Despite the outward appearance of peace, monasteries faced threats from the outside world: raids, political upheaval, and plagues. Their remote locations offered some protection, but also isolation, which could be both a blessing and a curse. The monks' strict routines and spiritual focus were not just about devotion, they were survival strategies in a world full of uncertainty. The discipline fostered resilience, while the community offered social and economic support. This hidden complexity raises questions about how we view medieval monasteries. Were they simply places of quiet contemplation? Or were they vibrant, sometimes fragile communities navigating human challenges as much as spiritual ones? And how did the monks' struggles and adaptations shape the preservation of knowledge and culture through the Middle Ages? As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into the daily life of a medieval monastery, it becomes clear that these communities were far more than places of quiet prayer and work. Their endurance over centuries, through war, famine, and political change, left an imprint not only on medieval society but on the foundation of Western civilization itself. Monasteries were centers of stability in an often unstable world. Their ability to preserve knowledge through the Dark Ages, through meticulous copying of manuscripts, ensured that much of classical philosophy, science, and literature survived for future generations. Without this dedication to preservation, many ancient works might have been lost entirely. The economic role of monasteries was also significant. They managed vast tracts of land, operated farms, mills, breweries, and workshops, and contributed to the local economy. Their practices influenced agricultural development, and their organization offered a model for community life and labor management. On a spiritual level, monasteries shaped the religious landscape of medieval Europe. They were centers of pilgrimage, education, and charity, offering care for the sick and poor. The monastic ideal influenced other religious movements and helped shape Western notions of discipline, devotion, and communal living. Yet the monastic life was not without its critics and challenges. Over time, some monasteries accumulated wealth and power that led to corruption and decline, prompting reforms and sometimes suppression. The tension between spiritual ideals and worldly realities was an ongoing struggle. For the individual monks, life was a mix of devotion, hardship, routine, and occasional moments of quiet joy or intellectual fulfillment. Their stories remind us that history is shaped not only by kings and battles, but by countless ordinary lives committed to survival and purpose. As you reflect on the daily grind inside these stone walls, consider how the silent labor and resilience of monks influenced not just their own time, but the course of history. How might their commitment to community and knowledge inspire us today, in a world that often values speed and spectacle over steadiness and depth? And finally, what lessons lie in their balance of discipline and contemplation? Lessons about finding meaning in routine, and about enduring through times of uncertainty. The life of a medieval apothecary, healing with herbs and patient step quietly into the shadowed interior of a medieval apothecary's shop. You might expect a bustling place full of bright potions and frantic cures, but instead, you find a dimly lit room lined with shelves holding jars, bottles, and bundles of dried herbs. The air carries a subtle mix of scents: earthy roots, sharp spices, faintly sweet flowers, a quiet reminder of the natural world's role in medieval medicine. The apothecary, neither a doctor nor a simple merchant, occupies a unique niche in medieval society. His trade blends practical knowledge of plants and substances with the slow, patient art of preparation and measurement. The work is meticulous, sometimes tedious, but vital for the health of town and country alike. Unlike today's pharmacies, the medieval apothecary's shop was more than a place to pick up remedies. It was a center of knowledge and experimentation. Manuscripts containing herbal lore, recipes, and medical theories were carefully studied and copied. Some apothecaries maintained their own notebooks, recording successes and failures, adding to a growing but still fragile body of healing wisdom. The apothecary sourced ingredients locally and from afar. Roots, leaves, and flowers from nearby fields and forests formed the bulk of supplies, but exotic spices, minerals, and animal products were imported along trade routes reaching from the Mediterranean to the east. These rarer materials, expensive and precious, were often reserved for wealthier clients or serious ailments. Preparation involved grinding, mixing, distilling, and infusing ingredients into salves, tinctures, powders, and syrups. Each process required careful attention. 2. Much heat could ruin a batch. Too little might leave it ineffective. The apothecary's skill was measured by his patience and precision as much as his knowledge. Customers came for all manner of ailments: coughs, fevers, wounds, digestive troubles, and mysterious maladies with no clear cause. Sometimes the apothecary's advice extended beyond medicine to include diet, lifestyle, or spiritual remedies, reflecting the medieval worldview that linked body and soul. Apothecaries also worked closely with physicians and surgeons, though their roles often overlapped, and sometimes competed. Physicians, trained at universities, dealt more with diagnosis and theory, while apothecaries provided the practical means of treatment. Their cooperation was essential, but could be fraught with tensions over status and expertise. Behind the scenes, the apothecary's life was one of careful routine and modest means. Shops were small and profits modest. The trade required continuous learning, patience with the slow rhythms of nature and human bodies, and a steady hand in the face of uncertainty. As you linger in this quiet place of bottles and roots, you might wonder, how did the apothecary's slow, careful craft influence the gradual development of medicine? And what stories lie in the unseen failures and small successes that shaped medieval healing? The life of a medieval apothecary was shaped not only by the quiet routines of grinding herbs and mixing potions, but also by the delicate balancing act of knowledge, commerce, and community trust. Unlike the dramatic tales of battlefield surgeons or royal physicians, the apothecary's story unfolds in the slow, steady pace of daily life, where patience was as vital as any ingredient. Apothecaries operated at the crossroads of tradition and innovation. Much of their knowledge came from ancient texts, works by Greek and Roman authors like Dioscorides and Galen, which had been translated and preserved through the centuries. These texts described plants, minerals, and their supposed effects, often mingled with superstition and religious beliefs. Apothecaries had to learn to sift through these layers, applying practical experience to determine what worked and what did not. Trade routes brought new ingredients and ideas. Spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and pepper arrived from the East, prized not only for flavoring food, but for their medicinal properties. Some of these exotic materials were so valuable they resembled precious metals. Yet their effects were not always understood, and sometimes they were used more for prestige than healing. The sourcing and preparation of ingredients posed challenges. Herbs had to be harvested at the right time, dried properly, and stored carefully to maintain potency. Mistakes could spoil an entire batch, wasting precious materials and leaving a patient untreated. The apothecary's skill was therefore as much in horticulture and chemistry as in medicine. Apothecaries also had to navigate relationships with other medical practitioners and with their clients. Physicians might view apothecaries as mere tradesmen, while apothecaries sometimes resented the academic arrogance of doctors. This professional tension shaped how medicine was practiced and perceived in medieval towns. Building trust with customers was crucial. Remedies were often prescribed based on symptoms rather than diagnosis, and the effectiveness of treatments was unpredictable. The apothecary's reputation depended on patience, honesty, and a careful approach, as failed treatments could lead to loss of clientele or even accusations of malpractice. Beyond physical remedies, apothecaries sometimes incorporated spiritual elements into their work. Amulets, prayers, and rituals could accompany medicine, reflecting the belief that healing involved body, mind, and soul. This holistic approach, while less scientific by modern standards, was part of a broader medieval understanding of health. The economic realities of the trade were modest. Apothecaries charged for materials and labor, but many lived modestly. Their shops were often small and tucked away in narrow streets. Yet despite these limitations, apothecaries played an essential role in community health, especially in towns, where access to physicians was limited. This balance of knowledge, craft, and social navigation made the apothecary a quietly vital figure in medieval society. Their slow, patient work laid groundwork that centuries later would evolve into modern pharmacy and medicine. What then can we learn from this unhurried craft about the evolution of healing? And how might the apothecary's blend of science, nature, and care still resonate in today's fast-paced world? As we draw this story to a close, consider how the humble medieval apothecary, working quietly amid shelves of roots and powders, laid important foundations for the future of medicine and pharmacy. Though often overshadowed by grand historical events and famous figures, their patient work bridged ancient knowledge and emerging science. By the late Middle Ages, apothecaries began to organize themselves more formally, creating guilds to regulate quality, training, and ethics. This development helped standardize practices and protect consumers, reflecting an early recognition that medicine required careful oversight. The guild system also fostered apprenticeship, ensuring that knowledge was passed down through generations. The rise of universities and medical schools slowly transformed the medical profession. Physicians increasingly relied on formal education and clinical experience, while apothecaries specialized in the preparation and dispensing of remedies. This division of labor contributed to the gradual professionalization of medicine. However, it was not until the Renaissance and early modern period that experimental science started to reshape medicine fundamentally. The apothecary's art of extracting and compounding remedies evolved into chemistry and pharmacology, disciplines that would revolutionize how diseases were treated. Despite these advances, many principles from the medieval apothecary's craft persist. The careful sourcing of natural ingredients, the precision in compounding medicines, and the importance of patient trust remain cornerstones of pharmaceutical practice. Modern pharmacists still owe much to those early practitioners who combined knowledge, skill, and care. Moreover, the apothecary's role as a community figure, accessible, knowledgeable, and attentive, reminds us of the human side of healing. In an era increasingly dominated by technology and specialization, the medieval apothecary's balance of science, nature, and personal care invites reflection on how medicine can maintain its connection to people's daily lives. As you consider this quiet history, you might ask, in what ways does the apothecary's slow, patient craft challenge today's fast-paced approach to health and medicine? And what might we regain by remembering the simple, enduring art of healing with herbs and patience in the quiet folds of history? It's the ordinary moments that endure, soft whispers of resilience and patience. Rest now, and let these gentle echoes cradle you into peaceful dreams. Good night.